Good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion Tiles in Mexico, working on oil painting Young Love, Super Mario Brothers, and a Suicide. Alright, since the last time I videoed this, I've done some detailing to this little car and the bottle itself. The initial rendering of the car was kind of a cross between a Suzuki Sidekick and a Buick, and I just kind of squared off the back and made it a little more Jeepish, since it was kind of leaning in that direction anyway, and the back end didn't look quite right. So I fixed that, the headlights, the little grill work, windshields, things like that. And what else have I done? That's about it. I mostly just kind of detailed, played with that a little bit. But right now, I'm going to start with some reflected light emanating from the pink sun, draping down across the main central figure's head, shoulder blade, and ground here. Then probably some reddish light casting from this sun onto this scene. A little red translucent smear, making the bottle more of a bottle, and some reflected light off the glass on her skin and hair and some surrounding various details. Mixed up some pink glaze for the pink, some bright yellow glaze for doing some of the yellows, and a little bit of sienna and gold for the girls' hair. Okay, here we go.
And this word is interesting, alienation. Our alienation from ourselves has caused us to set up a number of straw men that are keeping us from building actually a mature model of how the universe really works. The content of the dialogue with the other is a content that indicates that man's horizons are infinitely bright, that death is in fact, well, as Thomas Vaughan put it, the body is the placenta of the soul. And this fact has not yet been assimilated because it runs counter to Western reductionist, materialist empiricism. But this idea that the body is placenta to the soul is not an object of faith or a dogma. It's a program for activity. The activity that it implies should be undertaken is a familiarization with the soul. And the soul has been banned from Western thinking about the self for nigh on 400 years, at least in leading circles. But I take this concept very seriously, and I think if any of you are familiar with the literature of alchemy, alchemy is about the generation of a psychic construct, a wholeness, a thing which has many properties, which is paradoxical, which is both mind and matter, which can do anything. This is the last gasp of the soul before it's submerged completely. In other words, it became trapped in an association with chthonic matter in the last historical epoch before it disappeared completely from Western consciousness. Psychedelic drugs, especially psilocybin, allow a searchlight to be thrown on these deeper levels of the psyche, as Jung correctly stated, but it is not a museum of archetypes or psychic constructs, as he seemed to assume. It is a frontier of wholeness into which any person so motivated and so courageous as to wish to do it can go and leave the mundane plane far behind. In other words, it is a dimension of vertical gain that is real and is present in all of our lives, and that we do not acknowledge except as an anomaly because we have been told that it's an anomaly. We have been told that these perceptions have to be devalued. The result of this is to so distort the psychic life of the species in the present historical context that we have this UFO disease, which is essentially a rupture into three-dimensional space of this archetype of wholeness, and it haunts time like a ghost, and it haunts human experience in the 20th century because it is a symbol of alienation, and the word alien has in fact come to be applied to this thing. It is alien. It comes from the stars. It is totally non-human. It has great potential for mankind, but it can barely be Englished at all. And actually, what it is the self in the form in which it is most accessible to the ego, given the ego's programming with all the scientific garbage about the density of life in the universe, the distance to the stars, the probability of chemical evolution occurring here and there and yonder. It is, in other words, something which, in order not to alarm us, has disguised itself as an extraterrestrial being, but is in fact the collectivity of the human psyche, signaling a profound historical crisis. I talked about this before. I talked about the danger of succumbing to belief in UFOs because of the damage it did to free will. And that, yes, the UFO is making war on science, because science has created such a masculine overbalance in the intellectual life of the species that this automatic mechanism has been triggered. A history-stopping archetype is being released into the skies of this planet, and if we are not careful, it will halt all intellectual inquiry in the same way that the Christos archetype halted intellectual inquiry in the Hellenistic age. I don't want to go into this too deeply, but it's clear to me that Hellenistic science was destroyed by the Christos archetype because the Democritean atomists and materialists who ran Roman civilization had no patience whatsoever with this superstition that was being circulated among the servants about a man who rose from the dead and all that went with it. But before they knew what had happened, their whole civilization was in ruin because the archetype had frozen the forward thrust of this masculine, dominant, ethically depotentiated, technologically obsessed, slave-built society. And for 1,000 years, hydrostatics, mathematics, metallurgy, you name it, that was nothing. Only the words of one Galilean radical could occupy the time of any intellectual successfully. Okay, we have now, 2,000 years later, fought our way somewhat clear of that problem. But the problem it solved, which is the problem of this masculine overbalance and this obsessive technological thrust, this dehumanizing thrust, has reached an even more intense peak. And now appears the flying saucer with the capacity of undoing that by again destroying science, by simply being a miracle. That's all that is required to wreck science, is a miracle visible worldwide. And this, because scientists say that that can't happen. Consequently, if it does happen, their house is in real disorder. So I touched on this before, any of you who heard me. Tonight I want to talk more about the flying saucer, not from the point of view of the people who are going to get the whammy when it appears unbidden, but from the point of view of an insider. In other words, one can do more than simply say, oh yes, I understand what this is. The overmind is visibly manifest in the skies of Earth in order to skew history toward an eschatological mode that will stifle inquiry in order, basically, to preserve the species from extinction. But a mature humanity could get into a place where we no longer required these metaphysical spankings from messiahs and flying saucers that come along every 1,000 years or so to mess up the mess that has been created and to try and send people off on another tack. And the way to do this is to look at the abysses that confront man as species and individual and try to unify them. And I think that psilocybin offers a way out because it allows a dialogue with the overmind that is not, you won't read about it in Scientific American or anywhere else. You will carry it out. And the carrying out of this dialogue will essentially eschatologize you as a person and lift you out of the historical context. It's like Stephen Dedalus said in Ulysses, history is the nightmare that I am trying to awake from. Well, I would turn it around a bit and say history is what I am trying to go to sleep from in order to get away from it. In other words, the dream is eschatological. The dream is zero time and outside of history. Escape into the dream. Escape, a key thing charged against these drugs, that they are for escapists. I think the people who make this charge hardly dare dream to what degree they are escapists. Escape. Escape from the planet, from death, and from the problem, if possible, of the unspeakable. So now, to say a bit about death and dying, if you leave aside the last 300 years of historical experience as it was handled in Europe and America, and examine the phenomenon of death, the doctrine of the soul in all its ramifications, Neoplatonic, Christian, dynastic, Egyptian, etc. I'm sure you're all familiar with some or all of these. What you get is the idea that there is a light body or a thing, an intellect, that is somehow mixed up in the body during life and at death or at dying is involved in a crisis in which these two envelopes separate and one loses its raison d'etre and falls into dissolution, metabolism stops, and the other one goes we know not where. Perhaps nowhere, if you believe it doesn't exist, but then you have the problem of trying to explain life, which, by the way, though science makes great claims and is done very well in systems of nuclear particles and even simple atomic systems, the idea that science can make any statement about what life is or where it comes from is preposterous. Science has nothing to say about how you can decide to close your hand into a fist, and it happens. This is utterly outside the realm of scientific explanation, because what we see in that phenomenon is mind as a first cause. In other words, we see matter. It's an example of telekinesis. Matter is caused by mind to move. So we need not fear the sneers of science in the matter of the fate or origin of the soul. And as I say, my thrust into this has always been psychedelic experience, but I've been thinking recently more about dreams, because dreams are a much more generalized form of experience of the hyperdimension or the mode in which life and mind seem to be embedded. And looking at dreams and looking at what people with shamanic traditions say about dreams, you come to the realization that experientially for those people it is a parallel continuum. The shaman accesses it with hallucinogens or other things which I mentioned, but most efficaciously with hallucinogens. But everybody else accesses it through dreams. Now, Freud's idea about dreams was, I forget the German term, but he called them day residues. He always felt that you could trace the content of the dream down to a distortion of something that happened during the day or during waking time. I think that it's much more useful to try and make actually a kind of geometric model of consciousness, and to take seriously the idea of a parallel continuum, and to say that the mind and the body are embedded in the dream, and the dream is a kind, not a kind of, but a higher order spatial dimension, so that in sleep you are released into the real world, of which the world of waking is only the surface. And in a very literal sense, it's the surface. It's the surface in a geometric sense, that there is a plenum, and recent experiments in quantum physics tend to back this up. There is a holographic plenum of information. All information is everywhere. Information that is not here is nowhere. And that information stands outside of historical time. It's like Plato said, time is the moving image of eternity. Eternity, it does not have a temporal existence, even the kind of temporal existence where you say it always existed. It does not have temporal duration of any sort. It is eternity. We are not primarily biology, with mind emerging as a kind of iridescence, a kind of epiphenomenon at the higher levels of organization of biology. We are, in fact, hyperdimensional objects of some sort which cast a shadow into matter. And the shadow in matter is the body. And at death, what happens, basically, is that the shadow withdraws, or the thing which casts the shadow withdraws, and metabolism ceases, and matter, which had been organized into a dissipative structure in a very localized area, sustaining itself against entropy by cycling material in and degrading it and expelling it, that whole phenomenon ceases. But the thing which ordered it is not affected by that. And when I make these declarative statements, I'm making them from the point of view of this shamanic tradition, which touches all these higher religions. Everything, basically, except rationalism, holds to some version of what I'm saying. So then the psychedelic, the dream state and the psychedelic state acquire great import because there is then a task to life. And the task to life is to become familiar with this thing which is causing being, and to be familiar with it at the moment of passing. In other words, the metaphor is used by several traditions of a vehicle, an after-death vehicle, an astral body, something like that. And shamanism and certain yogas, Taoist yoga, claim very clearly that the purpose is to familiarize yourself with this after-death body in life. And then the act of dying will not create confusion in the psyche. You will recognize what is happening, you will know what to do, and you will make the clean break. And there does seem to be the possibility of a problem in dying. In other words, what I'm telling you is not that you're condemned to eternal life. I'm saying it's a possibility, but you can muff it through ignorance. In other words, at the moment of death, there is a kind of a separation. It's like birth. The metaphor is trivial but perfect. It is there is a possibility of damage, of incorrect activity. Again, William Blake, who said that as you start into the spiral, there is the possibility of falling from the golden track into eternal death. But it is only a crisis of a moment. It's a crisis of passage. And the whole purpose of shamanism and of life, correctly lived, is to strengthen the soul and to strengthen the relationship to the soul, so that this passage can be cleanly made. Okay, this is not anything earth-shaking, or it's well known. It's a traditional position, actually. But now I want to assimilate one more abyss into this model, one less familiar to us as rationalists, but well familiar to us just one level deeper in the psyche as Christians and Westerners. And that is this idea that the world will end, that there will be a final time, that there is not only the crisis of the death of the individual, there is the crisis of the death of the species. What this seems to be about is that from the time that there is an awareness of the existence of the soul, we'll say circa 50,000 BP, until the resolution of the apocalyptic potential, there's something like 50,000 years, which in biological time is only a moment, but it is the entire span of history times 5. In that period, everything hangs in the balance, because it is a mad rush from monkeydom to starshiphood. And in the leap across those 25,000 years, energies are released, religions are shot off like sparks, philosophies evolve and die, science arises, magic arises, all of these things which control power with greater and lesser degrees of ethical constancy appear. There is the possibility, as in the metaphor of dying, there is the possibility of mucking it up, of aborting the species transformation into a hyperspatial intellect. We are now, there can be no doubt that we are now in the final seconds of that crisis, a crisis which involves the end of history, the departure from the planet, the triumph over death, and the release of the individual from matter. We are, in fact, closing distance with the most profound event a planetary ecology can encounter, which is the freeing of life from the dark chrysalis of matter. The old metaphor of psyche as the butterfly is a species-wide metaphor. We must undergo a metamorphosis in order to survive the momentum of the historical forces already in motion. Well, if you know anything about evolutionary biology, you know that man is considered to be an unevolving species. In other words, sometime in the last 100,000 years, with the invention of culture, the biological evolution of man ceased, and evolution became a cultural phenomenon. Tools, languages, and philosophies began to evolve, but the human somatype began to remain the same. And so we are very much like people a long time ago. But technology is the real skin of our species. Man, correctly seen in the context of the last
All right, I think that does it for the moment. Here, I'll zoom in a little bit.
Of a technological
About a bit.
We take in matter that is has a
so you can see it starts getting some light and depth to the hand, little reflected light on this lower scene,
Gospels, space shuttles, all of these things.
and some more modeling reflected light and detail on the bottle and truck.
Technological reef of extruded psychic objects. And the tool is the flying saucer or the soul.
So that does it for the moment. Thank you for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico. Working on oil painting, Young Love, Super Mario Brothers, and a suicide. Have a good night, Earth.
How man may be dirigible is based